Be juror number 90.
He's indicated a request for private conversation, Your Honor. Questions 6 and 8 on page 13.
Yep. Afternoon, come on up. Have a seat. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Couple things before I turn the questioning over to the attorneys. First, to note that you did indicate a need for privacy for some, so we're going to respect that. We'll probably take care of that first, but a couple of preliminary questions. Well, first of all, let me swear you in so that all your answers are under oath. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that you will truthfully answer all questions about your qualifications to serve as a juror?
I do.
All right, thank you. Well, first of all, you filled out a questionnaire, and thank you. That was a great help to get us started. Was everything true on that questionnaire?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Was everything true on that questionnaire, as far as your answers?
Yes.
Okay. As you sit here right now, any changes or additions to that questionnaire?
I don't believe so at this time.
Okay, and that's a very general question. What we find is that because of the passage of a few months, that many jurors find that, on reflection, that some of the things they say could be wrong, or they need to add certain facts, or maybe even their opinions have evolved. And so, if anything like that comes up, I just want you to feel comfortable saying something different or additional that was not in the questionnaire. Okay?
I understand.
All right. You were not supposed to read any newspaper articles or really any news through any media about this case. But we understand it's been a few months since the questionnaire. You may have been exposed inadvertently because there have been a lot of news about this case. Can you think of anything you've been exposed to since you filled out the questionnaire and today, as far as news information?
The only news that I can recall reading about this case since I filled out the questionnaire was awareness of the fact that jury selection was proceeding.
All right. In fact, I forgot to say, your voice is nice and strong, so it's not a problem, but we have plexiglass in front of you and between us, and also plexiglass in front of the attorneys. I'll keep my mask on, but if you wanted to remove your mask either for comfort or to speak more clearly, feel free to do so. I'm kind of leaving that in your hands. And even if you do remove it at some point, you can put it back on. It's totally up to you. But in any case, did you hear about any related cases, parties, lawsuits, anything like that since you filled out the questionnaire?
Not that I can recall.
Okay. The whole point of this being that just about everybody who has filled out the questionnaire has heard something about the case. Some of it might be accurate, some of it might not be, but we don't expect that you've not heard anything, or even that you have not formed an opinion. It's perfectly fine to form opinions based on what you've heard. What you have to do, however, if you're a juror, is to put all that aside. Decide this case just on the facts and just on the law that I give you. Some jurors will say, I can do that. Others will say, either A, I'm not the type of person who can do that, or I read so much and know so much and have been so firmly entrenched in my opinion that I can't be that person. So that's the whole point of asking the questions about what you know. At this point, do you think you could be fair and impartial?
I do.
Okay. Can you decide the case only on what you hear and see in the courtroom?
I believe so.
Okay. The lawyers are probably going to press you a little more on that. Let me ask you an easier question. Do you recognize any witnesses on the witness list?
No.
Okay. And this trial is going to be about 4 weeks long once we start on March 29th. Does that work for you, or can you make it work with your personal and professional life?
Would I be expected to sequester during that time?
It's a possibility. We're not planning on it during the trial. Definitely sequestered during deliberations.
Understood.
Okay, possibly during trial, but that's not the plan. But if things happen that we have to, we have to.
I believe I could.
Okay. Then I'm going to find under the rules that there are items on your questionnaire that require more private conversation. So what I'm going to do at this time is, under the rules, find that these are deeply personal items that need discussion off audio. So we will go off the audio. Nelson to ask some questions.
Afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Going to ask you a few questions just to kind of get to know you a little bit better, and then I'm going to focus on some of your responses to the questionnaire, okay?
Understood.
I'm not trying to trick you or anything of that nature. I'll obviously read what you wrote for purposes of your recollection as well as the record, okay?
Understood.
All right, so let's assume you and I were to meet in a different circumstance. We met at a party or some social event, and we strike up a conversation. What are a couple of things I'm going to learn about you during that conversation?
Likely that my job, I work as an IT systems administrator, and my love of tabletop games.
Okay, great. When you received, you obviously had heard about this case beforehand, right? Before you knew you were a potential juror.
Yes.
And I think based on your questionnaire, you followed it quite closely. You and your friends followed it quite closely.
Yes.
All right. And then you received this packet of information in the mail, and you learned that you were a potential juror on this case. What was your first response to that?
A deep breath, running my hands through my hair, and swearing quietly.
Okay. Why that response? I mean,
This is a very high-profile case, one where being involved in it at all, even as a potential juror, has made me feel somewhat concerned for my well-being, and because the idea of being involved in a high-profile case like this is a daunting responsibility.
okay. So what about your personal safety? I mean, why were you concerned about your personal safety?
Because, with all due respect to this court and its proceedings, I assume that my identity is stored in some electronic record somewhere, and from my job I know that no electronic record is completely safe. And frankly, I feel that whichever way this case is decided, a lot of people are going to be very angry about that.
Okay. Is there one verdict? There's two possible verdicts, right? Guilty or not guilty. Is there one verdict that you think would draw a more a response that would put your safety in greater jeopardy?
Yes.
Would you would that concern or that fear affect your ability to reach that verdict?
No.
Okay. So, I believe based on your answers from your questionnaire that you would be more concerned that if there was a guilty verdict of who may present you with harm.
Can you clarify the question, please?
Based on your answers in the questionnaire, which we'll talk about in a little bit, I believe that you feel that if you were to convict Mr. Chauvin of these offenses, the likelihood of harm is greater.
Yes.
Okay. So from people who might support Mr. Chauvin, they would present you with a greater risk.
Yes.
And so my question is, sitting here right now, can you foresee yourself voting not guilty?
Voting not guilty? Yes.
Okay. So you understand that that's a possibility.
Yes.
And guilty is a possibility as well.
Yes.
And so your concern, let me ask you this, when you got to the government center this morning or earlier today and you saw the fortifications and the army and all of that stuff, what was your reaction to that?
I felt very nervous, even as someone who I knew was required by law to be here. Felt very nervous passing through that.
Okay. Did you feel in any way safer, or did it make you more concerned about your physical safety?
In one respect, I felt safer because I knew I wouldn't need to worry about the possibility of some unforeseen actor coming in from the outside and disrupting things. On the other hand, it makes me feel a little more concerned simply on the grounds that it makes me feel that clearly the government feels all these precautions are necessary.
Okay. And you may disagree with the necessity of these precautions?
I think the precautions are probably. I understand I understand why the government chose to put these precautions in place. I do not necessarily disagree with that necessity. It's just that it implies to me that there was some reason they believed why it was necessary.
Okay. When you heard that we're doing everything we can to preserve your anonymity, did that alleviate any of your concerns?
Yes.
Now, at some point, when the judge deems it safe to do so, do you understand that your identity could be released?
Yes.
And we don't know when that is. The court will determine that when it's safe. Does that cause you concern?
It does cause me concern, yes.
And for the same reasons you stated before?
Yes.
Essentially, that if you were to find Mr. Chauvin guilty, you may become a target yourself.
Yes.
So the back to the original question is, if you were deliberating in this case, would you be able to set aside your concerns, analyze the evidence based on what comes in during court, and issue a verdict based on the law and the evidence?
Yes, I would.
In your personal or professional life, can you think of a circumstance where you've been called upon to resolve conflict?
Give me a minute while I think. Yes, I can think of a couple such cases.
All right. So when you're tasked with that, how do you approach that process? How do you resolve conflict between two people?
Generally, the way I would resolve conflict between people would be to try to find common ground, try to cool tempers, or to make sure that my first goal would be to try to clear up any misunderstandings, and then to establish common ground between the parties who are in conflict, to break up tension by lightening the mood.
Okay. So you understand that this case is fraught with conflict. Do you understand that?
Yes.
And it's obviously, in a broad sense, it's the state of Minnesota versus Derek Chauvin. You understand that?
Yes.
And that's ultimately a conflict that you're going to have to, if you sit on this jury, resolve.
Yes.
But in the more immediate sense, if you were a juror on this case, you would be in the deliberation room, and conflict between two people or conflict involving yourself may arise. Do you think that there's a difference in how you approach conflict if you're a member or a participant in the conflict versus an outside observer being asked to resolve that conflict?
Yes, there is.
And what is that difference?
External conflict, I find it's much easier to approach with perhaps a critical or dispassionate eye. As I explained, internal conflict, with an external conflict, I tend to try to remain impartial. With internal conflict, that's generally not an option to the same degree.
Okay.
So I have to weigh which side of the conflict I find more compelling.
Are you willing to re-examine your position based on the input of others?
Yes.
Are you willing to stand your ground if you're so convinced that you're right?
Yes.
Can you think of a situation in your life where you've been confident that you were 100% correct, only to later learn that you were wrong?
Absolutely.
And how do you approach that?
I try to approach it with good grace. In my hobbies, doing design work, I often find that my initial intuitions, the way I've described it to friends and colleagues, is I will be absolutely convinced I am right. You will tell me I am wrong, and 48 hours later I will tell you that you were correct the whole time, and I don't see how I could have ever believed otherwise.
Okay, fair enough. Now, ultimately, again, if you were a juror in this case, the judge is going to tell you what the law is at the end. You have to decide the facts of the case and how the law applies to the facts as you decide it. You may read the law and you may disagree with the judge. You may think, that can't be right. Or you may think, we really need to change this law. Can you apply the law to the facts of this case based upon the evidence presented in this court alone, even if you think the law is wrong or should be changed?
Yes, that's the responsibility of a juror.
So I'm going to ask you a few follow-up questions on your questionnaire, sir. Again, everybody who's been here has been exposed to this case to varying degrees, and so we're not questioning that at this point. All right. But ultimately, we have to decide if you are the right juror for this particular case. All right. So you were asked a series of questions about, or there were some questions about a video that went viral and became news. And you said you've never seen this video.
That's correct.
All right. Have you seen any parts of this video on news or still photos of this video? Anything about this video that you've ever been exposed to?
I believe I've seen still photos of it.
Okay. Like on internet news websites and things of that nature?
Yes.
But you have never watched any portion of this video?
Correct.
All right. So would you agree with the general premise that words have meaning?
Yes.
Would you agree that sometimes the words we choose to use are reflective of our thoughts, opinions, or beliefs?
Yes.
All right. You were asked to describe what you had heard about this statement, and you wrote, George Floyd was a black man accused of passing a counterfeit bill to purchase cigarettes. He was accosted by the police, and after an argument was pinned to the ground. Chauvin placed his knee on Floyd's neck and kept it there for over 8 minutes while Floyd protested that he could not breathe. That's the first part of what you wrote. Why did you choose the word accosted?
I don't know off the top of my head why I wrote that at that time. Thinking about that choice of words now, I don't know I can give you a definitive answer.
Okay. I mean, would you agree that the word accosted infers an evil intent?
Most likely, yes.
You wrote that despite Floyd's pleas, which stopped after he lost consciousness, approximately 5 minutes in, Chauvin continued to pin Floyd to the ground until someone pointed out to him that Floyd was dead. And you've just gleaned this from news articles and conversations with friends, correct?
Yes.
Not watched the video.
Correct.
You were asked about your impression of Mr. Chauvin, and you checked the box very negative. And when asked, when asked why, you wrote, I do not see how an officer could justify causing the death of a nonviolent alleged criminal well after he ceased to pose any credible threat. Remember writing that?
Yes.
Okay. So let's talk about that. First and foremost, you have formed an impression that a very negative impression of Mr. Chauvin.
Yes.
And you have formed the impression that Mr. Chauvin caused Mr. Floyd's death.
Yes.
And you formed an impression, at least as it relates to Mr. Chauvin, that Mr. Floyd was a nonviolent alleged criminal.
Yes.
Now, with respect to Mr. Floyd and your general impression of Mr. Floyd, you wrote, as I understand, Floyd was not a threat, and his alleged wrongdoings certainly did not merit the use of lethal force. That's what you wrote. So, again, you have formed an opinion or an impression that the force that was used in this case was lethal.
Yes.
When asked about your conversations with family, friends, or coworkers, or whether you've posted anything online, you checked yes. Let me ask you first, have you posted any opinions online?
Regarding this case?
Yes.
No, I have not.
But what you have expressed to your friends, you have expressed a sympathy with the protesters and their cause, and have discussed the militarization and systematic racism of policing in America.
Yes.
So again, you have, your opinions are your opinions, and I do not invalidate your opinions by my I'm trying not to invalidate your opinions by my questions. But obviously, you have formed strong opinions about this case. Agreed?
Yes.
You have formed an opinion that Mr. Chauvin caused Mr. Floyd's death.
Yes.
You have formed an opinion that the amount of force that Mr. Chauvin used against Mr. Floyd was in and of itself lethal force.
Yes.
You have an opinion that policing in America is systematic racism, or involves or incorporates systematic racism, and an over-militarization of the modern police force.
Yes.
So your views are strong. Agreed?
Yes.
There's what's called the presumption of innocence. You're familiar with that?
Yes.
Right? You understand that Mr. Chauvin does not have to testify.
Yes.
You understand that Mr. Chauvin is not required to present a single shred of evidence in this case.
Yes.
You understand that we don't have to ask a single question.
Yes.
And at the starting point, right? The starting point is Mr. Chauvin is presumed innocent.
Yes.
So my concern, and you believe that you can be fair and impartial in this case.
I do.
Okay. So you've got these strong opinions,
Yes.
right? You can set all of those opinions aside, right? You can, your beliefs about policing, the cause of death, the use of force, all of those things that you've already decided and formed opinions on, you can set them to the side and be fair and impartial.
May I clarify rather than giving a simple yes or no?
Sure, please do.
The issue at my role as a potential juror in this case is to be a potential trier of fact. My moral judgments, as I was asked before, regarding the law and the nature of policing are not relevant to the question of fact in the eyes of the law, which would be my responsibility as a juror.
Okay. So, despite all of that, right? I mean, you have you watch certain pieces of evidence in this particular case, or you learn about certain training methods of the Minneapolis Police Department, or you learn certain medical information, right? That's the evidence that comes in this case. You would just simply abandon your beliefs about the over-militarization of the police when you see training videos of them pinning people to the ground or whatever? You don't think it shapes your ability to impartially try this case?
Again, I don't believe that it would necessarily affect my core convictions, but again, my opinions of what the law is and of what the system of policing in this nation is are not relevant to the question of whether the prosecution proves beyond a reasonable doubt whether the defendant has committed the crime of which he is accused.
In the questionnaire, you were asked to rank your opinions up to various kind of broad or blanket type statements, from strongly agree to strongly disagree. Do you recall that exercise in this questionnaire?
Vaguely, yes.
So I want to just cover a couple of your opinions on these. The statement reads, discrimination is not as bad as the media makes it out to be. and you strongly disagreed with that notion. Can you explain that?
I believe that racial discrimination, for example, is a serious problem in this country. That we see examples of this in the media, but I don't know if I would say it's necessarily worse than the media. Than the media. Makes it out to be. But I believe that they're certainly not underplaying it.
The statement reads, blacks and other minorities do not receive equal treatment as whites in the criminal justice system, and you strongly agreed with that.
That's correct.
And is that based on personal knowledge, talking with friends, studies? Like, what leads you to the belief that you would strongly agree with the notion that minorities do not receive equal treatment?
That's based on reports that I've read in the media, discussions of studies of prison populations, of sentencing for drug offenses, for example, the difference in how neighborhoods with various ethnic compositions are policed, and so on.
The statement says, police in this country treat whites and blacks equally, and you strongly disagreed with that.
Yes.
So let me put it to you this way. Simply because a police officer pulls over a minority person, is that discrimination?
Not in and of itself, no.
But it's your position that it happens more to minorities simply by virtue of a discriminatory act.
Yes, or that the likely outcomes are likely to be worse.
So that that if you are a minority, you have a higher likelihood of it ending tragically.
Yes.
And the question reads, or the statement reads, police in my community make me feel safe, and you somewhat disagreed with that. Why?
Well, mostly in light of everything that's been going on surrounding this case and related events. Also, simply the fact that, to be perfectly blunt, I'm always a little wary of anyone with guns being in my general vicinity.
Okay. The question or statement reads, I do not trust the police, and you strongly agree with that.
That's correct.
So you understand that there's going to be a lot of police officers that testify in this case.
Yes.
You understand that the majority of those people who testify will be called by the government.
Yes.
And so when you say you mistrust or do not trust the police, and that you strongly agree with that proposition, can you take the word of a police officer who testifies under oath in this case?
No, I cannot.
Would the court like to inquire further?
Mr. Swisher, would you like to inquire?
Yes, sir. It's upside down. Okay.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, I'd like to follow up on that line of questioning. You've indicated that you have a fairly strong mistrust of the police. True?
Yes.
But if you could imagine a situation where you have a police officer testifying to an event, not necessarily an opinion, but an event, like the light was green, versus a bystander testifying as to the same event, and let's say the bystander says the light was red. Now, solely based on the person being a police officer versus a bystander, do you think that you would tend to believe the police officer more or less simply because they're a police officer?
It would depend on what the circumstances were.
And what would some of those circumstances be?
If, for example, to invert your example, if a police officer were to say that the light had been red when another police officer had pulled someone over and a bystander said the light was green, therefore, if the second police officer who were testifying this were covering for the first police officer by saying that the light was red, I would be more inclined to trust the bystander. If it were an issue where the fact that they were a police officer was incidental, I don't believe it would color my judgment one way or the other.
And let's say it's just simply the example of the police officer versus the bystander, but the police officer was standing 5 feet away from the light. The bystander was standing back, 100 feet from the light. Would you tend to believe the police officer or the bystander?
Again, it would depend somewhat on the circumstances, but I think I'd be more inclined to believe the police officer in that circumstance.
And why is that?
Because they were closer to the event. They were at the heart of it. It's much less possible that they could have been innocently mistaken.
And so it sounds like from your answer, it would depend on the circumstances, not necessarily that the person was a police officer or not a police officer, but it would be based upon, say, their opportunity to see the event?
That would be a big part of it, yes.
There may be other factors unrelated to there being a police officer that would cause you to favor one witness over another?
Yes.
And the real question here is, if you were called and selected to be a juror in this case, would you honestly, in all honesty, be able to set aside any preconceived bias you have about any occupation, police officer or not a police officer, and judge the case solely based on the evidence and not on your preconceived notions? Would you be able to do that, or would you struggle with it?
I would attempt to judge the case as best I was able based on the evidence. However, I believe part of the instructions I was given were that it would be my role to judge which evidence was most credible, and it would factor into my weighting of evidence in that regard.
And so if following the instructions and you knew that you had to make a credibility determination, do you believe that you would not be able to set aside some opinions that you hold about police officers and judge their testimony on the same level as any other witness? You would not be able to do that?
I do not believe I would be able to do so. That's correct.
Okay. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Juror 90, I'm going to excuse you from this panel. The deputy will take some paperwork from you, but thank you for all your very candid answers here and also for filling out the questionnaire. We appreciate your service. You won't be called in on any other cases, so you are removed from jury service completely.
Understood.
Any
Thank you, Your
questions?
Honor.
All right.